Anna, thank you very much for all of that reporting. Joining us now is our Clarissa Ward, CNN Chief International Correspondent, Levi West, Director of Terrorism Studies at Charles Sturt University in Australia, and Farhana Khera, Executive Director of Muslim Advocates. Farhana, I want to start with you. Obviously, this is a crime against civilization, but it is specifically targeted at Muslims, and I just don't know how Muslims are supposed to absorb that this morning. What are the conversations that the community's having?
It has been a very difficult last 12 hours or so. As I heard about this news and absorbing it, started reaching out to my friends, my colleagues, and just what I'm seeing even on social media. This is just absolutely heartbreaking, and my thoughts and prayers are with the victims and their families at this time. I think what is really a common theme I'm hearing is that, unfortunately, this is not surprising. The American Muslim community has experienced horrific attacks motivated by people who are inspired by white nationalist causes, whether it's attacks on our mosques, attempts to attack our communities, like from Islamburg to Kansas. So this has been going on for some time, and I think that the question that I'm really sitting with this morning, Allison, is this should be a wake-up call. The attack in New Zealand, we have seen the horrific attacks against not just Muslims, but the Jewish community, the Sikh community, not only in the United States, but around the world now. And this should be a wake-up call for political leaders to prioritize tackling this issue and preventing and deterring these types of attacks from occurring in the future.
I got to say, it should be a wake-up call, but it seems clear to me the alarm clock is broken because the language used in this disgusting manifesto is very similar to that we heard of the killer at the Pittsburgh synagogue. Invasion, other, anti-immigration. And Clarissa, it is clear that some of this language, which is coming from some of the highest places in the land and the world, is being weaponized now, and being weaponized, Clarissa, all around the world.
I mean, that's right. If you go through, if you pour over, John, this 87-page, I really hate to even call it a manifesto. It's more of a self-interview act of narcissism by a sociopathic murderer terrorist. But he does lay out very clearly and almost playfully at times, I would say, prevalent far right-wing tropes and memes that are being spread all over the internet, but which have also seeped into the mainstream political discourse. He talks a lot about the idea of invasion, of all the migrants coming from Muslim countries taking over white people, of the fact that Muslim communities have a higher birth rate than white Anglo-Saxon communities. He talks a lot about this idea of replacement, that their values, the white nationalist values, are being taken over. And very clearly, what struck me going through this is how similar the language is, not just to certain ugly discourse that we now hear in the mainstream political world, but also to groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. This manifesto is designed to provoke a retaliation. It's designed to try to create a wedge in liberal democratic societies and to precipitate more violence with the hopes of having a sort of all-out ideological war akin to the one that we saw during the Crusades. And I think it's very interesting the language that's used. The ISIS always called the West Crusaders. He, too, calls himself one of the Knights Templar, again, an allusion to the Crusades. Both of these abhorrent groups and ideas using very similar language, John.
Oh, that's always been striking, Clarissa. I mean, extremists are extremists.
The same hate playbook.
The same hate playbook, often the same language. It's really striking. And so,
I think
yeah, go ahead, Levi.
The important thing, I think, is that sitting above all of that is fascist ideas. So the ideas of supremacy and the idea of existential threat from an outgroup is a set of fascist ideas. We find exactly the same concept sitting in Nazism and National Socialism. And whether you then tweak that to suit a white supremacist audience or whether you tweak those ideas to suit a jihadist audience, the core of those ideas are fascism. And I think it's easy to get lost down in the weeds of exactly which manifestation that is. I think the other really important thing to keep in mind is that using terms like psychopath diminishes the responsibility that he has. There's nothing to suggest that this guy had mental health challenges of any description. His manifesto is clear and consistent with a whole bunch of ideas like that similar people have undertaken actions motivated by the same kinds of ideas. And I think it diminishes the levels of responsibility that he ought to carry for what he did to suggest that he is evil or a psychopath or has mental health issues when we don't really have any basis on which to assume that.
Yeah, Levi, I've been struggling with that. I'm glad you brought that up. I've been struggling with that this morning because what is the word to describe someone who, in cold blood, looks at someone and at point blank range who he doesn't know, shoots them in the head as they're praying, however old they are, children, elderly, whatever, and does it 49 times? I'm struggling with the language this morning of what we should use.
So if he has an ideological motivation, he's a terrorist. It's as simple as that. The fact that we can't understand his motivations or we don't agree with his motivations doesn't mean that they're necessarily incoherent or irrational or whatever the case may be. You know, once you adopt the foundational assumptions of the ideas that he believes in, then what he was doing makes perfect sense if you accept those foundational assumptions. So it's still a rational decision if you believe the same things he believes to be true about the world. So if you believe that the white race is under existential threat because Muslims and other communities are going to outgrow us in terms of fertility rates, then the actions that he's taking starts to make sense. But writing it off as either evil or mentally unstable because we can't understand it diminishes our capacity to analyze it.
And Farhana, I am struck by the globalization of this killer's thinking. Inside this manifesto, he talks about events all over the world. He has a knowledge of the Second Amendment battles in the United States. And I'm not bringing up that to talk about gun control. I'm bringing it up to talk about the fact that this is a guy keyed in to some of the discussions in the tension points that are happening everywhere.
Yeah,
Well,
absolutely.
To be fair, that just means it's got the internet, right?
Absolutely, and we've seen this time and time again, where there is clearly this kind of the racism, the anti-immigrant fervor that's motivating these groups, and this movement has really just metastasized across the country. I mean, it was just actually a year ago that President Trump retweeted a tweet from a racist British group called Britain First and its anti-Muslim videos and images. It's a group that's responsible for attacks on Muslims in Britain. There have been government officials in the United States who've hosted people like Geert Wilders, a Dutch government official who stokes anti-Muslim hate and bigotry. So there's definitely a disturbing exchange of ideas and one might even say coordination at times across the border. And I just want to go back to my earlier point too, John, which is that we really need our FBI director to prioritize how to address this issue of this threat. You know, after 9/11, Director Mueller said the #1 priority of the FBI is going to be counterterrorism. And let's see that priority focusing on the white nationalist threat. I'd like to see officials in Congress call Director Wray up to the Hill and brief them on what the FBI is doing to make this a priority.
Farhana, in terms of the solutions, I want to stick with you for one more second, because what about Facebook? What about Twitter? What about the fact that the playbook was on there? I mean, they claim to be trying to use artificial intelligence to crack down on some of these words that are loaded, but it's not working.
Yeah, it's a real issue that we have. We've been talking to Twitter, Facebook, Google, YouTube for several years now, expressing our concerns about the ways in which these platforms are being used and abused. Frankly, we've seen Twitter be more responsive than Facebook. We do think Facebook is kind of turning a bit of a blind eye and not doing as much as it can be doing to proactively remove this content. They do things in other countries to proactively remove content as a result of those governments requiring Facebook to do that in order to be able to operate in those countries. And we need Facebook to step up and to do more to regulate the content on its platform. Social media companies have a role to play as well.
I don't think there's any question. Go ahead, Levi.
They had the main shooter. Twitter had the main shooters